Welcome to Mobility, Work and Rights, the I Claim podcast, where we challenge common misunderstandings about irregular migration in Europe today. I am Nando Sigona, a sociologist based at the University of Birmingham in the UK, specializing in migration, displacement and citizenship. And I'm delighted to welcome here today's guest, Letizia Palumbo, for an interview special of Mobility, Work and Rights. Letizia is a researcher in social legal studies at the University of Venice. Her research focused on migrant labor, exploitation, trafficking, migrant rights, and women's rights, especially with regard to care and domestic work and agricultural sector. She is the author of Taking Vulnerabilities to Labour Exploitation Seriously, a critical analysis of legal and policy approaches and instruments in Europe. Welcome, Letizia.
Good morning.
So your book came out just a few months ago. What I want to ask you is, your work emphasized very much the structural dimension of vulnerability. Why is it critical to move beyond the kind of individualistic or circumstantial explanation when we address the issue of exploitation?
Thanks for the question. So in recent years, the concept of vulnerability has received increasing attention in research as well as in political and legal discourses. Challenging the idea of vulnerability as something static or fixed, scholars, in particular feminist, legal, and social scholars such as Martha Feynman, Judith Butler, have underlined the context-specific dimension of this concept, as always related to people's position in society and in power relations. So building on this theoretical framework, in my book, I call for a situational approach to vulnerability, one that takes into account the interplay of personal factors, but also structural and contextual factors which make a person vulnerable to exploitation or abuse by the others. So we can say, in other words, that this approach considers the interplay of factors that limit persons' choices, often leading them to accept abusive and exploitative relations in conditions and the condition as the lesser of the two evils. This situational approach helps to challenge dominant discourses, including legal and political discourses, considering exploitation as mainly connected to a dimension of contingency and exceptional cases, to be read only in terms of individualistic relationships, that means victims, exploiters relationships, and mainly requiring criminal law responses. In contrast to this view, the situational approach to vulnerability helps to consider exploitation as a structural component of capitalistic systems, which has expanded in the current neoliberal era, an era characterized by market deregulation and increasingly selective legal and policy regimes in the field of migration and social rights. We can say that in this perspective, considering the structural dimension of exploitation means also to consider its pervasive character in contemporary capitalistic systems. This means building on feminist analysis on social reproduction, considering also how labor exploitation also operates by compressing the condition and the costs related to the social reproductive sphere of the labor force. And as I stress in my book, the cases of the employment of migrant workers in sectors such as agriculture is emblematic in this sense. If we consider, for instance, the cases of informal encampments called ghetti, or in general the inadequate condition of migrant agricultural workers in many areas of the south of Italy.
So as a person that is trained in law as a legal expert, you are in a very sort of unique position because you do a lot of field work. You are basically, you really sort of go in the field to talk to people, and you really combine a lot of sort of legal expertise with in-depth ethnographic engagement with the situation that you sort of investigate. So I was wondering if you can provide us some example of the way that the migration regimes, the gender regimes, and economics precarity compound to create specific form of vulnerabilities from your sort of case studies.
So by adopting this situational and intersectional approach to vulnerability, building, as you said, on a social legal perspective, I think that an emblematic example of overlapping inequalities concerning, in particular, the precarious legal status, gender dynamics, and labor market discrimination is the case of women migrant workers employed, for instance, in the agricultural sector. In particular, the use of a gender lens highlights how in national labor markets characterized by segmentation and segregation based on gender, race, legal status, and other axes of discrimination, so-called or considered low-skilled migrant women, and in particular those without a residence permit or with a temporary precarious legal status, can find a job mainly in unprotected and low-paid sectors such as agriculture and domestic work that are characterized by tough and exploitative working conditions. In this context, and this is another factor of inequalities to be considered, family and care responsibility also play a crucial role. Indeed, if we consider that women in general, and in particular women migrant in the agricultural sector are the main responsible for reproductive work in the family, in particular care work, they have to face in this way with care and reproductive work within a context that is characterized by invisibility and social marginalization, and that they also have to face the associated needs for immediate income. So that means that this creates stress and anxiety in balancing work and family life, and at the same time in a social spatial marginalization, as I say, many agricultural women live in conditions of isolation and invisibility, and in the absence of effective institutional support and welfare services. That means that they also become dependent on others for access to resources and services, including, for instance, healthcare systems. So in this context, where we have the overlap of many factors and many axes of discrimination along the basis of legal status, gender, and nationality and other. So this dimension of dependency on the others also contribute to amplify situational vulnerabilities to exploitation and abuse, for instance, from employers, illegal gangbusters, or also husbands and partners, as in these cases, dynamics of exploitation often also intersect with gender violence, including domestic violence.
The work combined, obviously, an analysis of European EU legal and policy framework with sort of in-depth case studies from UK and Italy in particular in different sectors. I was wondering if, to what extent, in the work also try to look at where are the gaps and what are the things that could be done to address some of the this example of vulnerability for workers. So I was wondering if you can tell us, looking at the two, Italy and UK and European level, what can be done, in what ways policymakers can intervene and find in addressing the situation of vulnerability that you have identified with your research?
We have to first of all say that over the last few years, both in Italy, in the UK, and also at the EU level, there has been increasing attention to the issue of labor exploitation, forced labor, slavery, and trafficking, and with a special attention to sectors such as agriculture. But the main approach used to address this issue has been that relying on a temporary and emergency-based approach to address these issues. In particular, for instance, in Italy, over the last few years, there has been various initiatives and projects that have been funded and implemented to address labor exploitation and support victims. However, little, if anything at all, has been done in terms of structural action. For example, emblematic is the fact that nothing has been done to address fundamental issues such as the housing condition of farm workers, or to reform to change the migrant worker entry system in a way that supports and promotes regular and long-term migration pathways. At the same time, and I would also stress this, most of these actions have overlooked the gender dimension, failing to take into account the complexity of vulnerability experienced, for instance, by women migrant workers and their specific needs. So in general, we can say that the legal and policy frameworks addressing labor exploitation rely, as I said before, on temporary and emergency-based responses, looking at exploitation as exceptional cases rather than implementing policies to address it in its systemic dimension. So I think that today it is necessary to adopt structural policies that has to be implemented in different fields, such as migration, labor rights, and gender justice, placing at the center the needs and the rights of workers, respecting and promoting the agency, and providing them with concrete alternatives for a life and work free from exploitation.
Thank you. Now, it's just a final question. You also pay attention in your book to collective action and solidarity. What lesson can we learn from, can be drawn from the community initiatives, including the role, for example, of NGOs, civil society, migrant land organization that you have observed? How can they mitigate some of the negative impact of this situational structural inequality that you have identified?
So the community initiatives, including, for instance, action by the third sector and local organizations that I have studied in my research, make it clear to consider how the fact that labor exploitation cannot be addressed without adopting a social and human rights approach, which takes into account social inequalities in their context-specific dimension. There are important actions from the grassroots level that support migrant workers, for instance, to have access to material resources and services, including healthcare services, and support their limited mobility in a context, as I said before, characterized by social marginalization and invisibility. And I really think that the important lesson that can be drawn from these actions is that situational approach and contextual approach to vulnerability, considering also the intersection of the different axes of discrimination and oppressions, this approach had to pay attention to the fact that agency of workers should be recognized, and is really necessary to foster initiatives and actions that recognize and support the agency of workers, in particular migrant workers, allowing them to share their needs and experiences of rights violation and abuse, and supporting and assisting them in becoming actively involved in institutional and political forums to advocate for their rights and demands.
You look at two different sectors, no? You look at domestic work mostly and the agriculture. And, the recommendation you gave are very much based in general on migrant work that exploitation. I was wondering if you observed the big differences between these two sectors in terms of being able to create solidarity, being able to mobilize collective action.
First of all, of course, it really depends on the different context. And I carry out my fieldwork mainly in Sicily. I would say that in Sicily, in Italy, in the UK, there are other dynamics to be considered. But if we focus on Italy, I would say that there are similarities in these sectors in terms of the dynamics of exploitation. And it's also important to stress that, as I said before, in a national labor market characterized by segregation on the basis of different axes of discrimination, it often happens that the limited mobility among sectors, in particular among domestic work and agricultural sector create a sort of circularity between these sectors, which also reflects on a circularity of forms of exploitation. So, for instance, women that have been employed in the domestic work sector and then move to the agricultural sector and then go back to the domestic work sector often experience dynamics of exploitation that are similar. And this is, I think, it's an interesting point to be considered. And at the same time, in terms of organization, I would say that the organization of domestic work in some of the areas that I have analyzed is quite active and interesting, involving involving domestic workers from different nationality and countries. On the contrary, in the agricultural sector, which has been and is still traditionally considered a male-dominated sector, the role of women, and in particular the role of migrant women in action, considering, for instance, the involvement also in trade unions, is still very, very low, which I think is one of the main critical points to be addressed. And it is interesting that, as I said before, talking about some of the initiatives that has been developed from grassroots level organization, there are many of these organizations that, for instance, in the area of the south of Italy, are trying to supporting and promoting an active role of women, in particular migrant women, in the collective and community initiatives that are aimed to foster and improve their rights.
Thanks a lot. I mean, this was extremely interesting, and it's really a topic at the center also of the I Claim project, where we're trying to explore both the different sectors and gender, and also the role of space, because obviously agriculture tend to be away from town, where there is less critical mass, and issues of visibility is really important, you know, in terms of if you have a more social, interactive kind of work, where you interact with work in a market, in a city, that you meet people, or where you live in more segregated. And we talked in previous episode about, for example, people that work at night and how the night become a way of hiding the precarious of legal status, but also means also opening up many more spaces for potential exploitation. So thank you very much for joining, Letizia, and thank you to our listeners that joined for this interview special of Mobility Worker Rights, the I Claim podcast. To make sure that you don't miss any episode in our series, please subscribe to your favorite podcast provider or join the I Claim mailing list on our website. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's discussion. Share your comments and questions with us via our website and social media. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.